Ministério do Turismo e Associação
The Ministry of Tourism and Associação Casa Azul present Flip Plus. This is a parallel program for the 19th Flip, and it is taught together with the partner organizations. The project has the support of the federal law for incentivizing culture. It has the official sponsorship of Itaú and the Vale Cultural Institute. Production by the Special Secretariat for Culture, Ministry of Tourism, the Ministry of Culture of Brazil. Now we will talk about collaborative survival and forests. Brazil is essential for us to understand the most pressing questions, such as the Amazon flexing point, the legacy of enslavement, the democracy frailty, and emergent ways of social mobilization and cultural expression. We work in an interactive way, and our studies will criticize and multiple intellectual aspects with perspectives that are normally marginalized in the academia. Our lab has different professors, teachers, researchers working in social sciences, natural sciences, engineering, arts, and humanities, interacting with researchers from different academic institutions, as well as non-for-profit research institutions. To answer to our contemporary demands will demand collective capacities to create new questions, to promote intercultural and experimental learning, to find new sources of evidence, and to see alternative collaborations. Our activities are structured by 5 different research centers: social scientific publication, protecting the Amazon, inequalities, racial frontiers, decolonization of arts, and our native population knowledge hub. We work in a multimodal way, combining historical and ethnographic analysis, big data, and visual strategies. We are committed with social and environmental justice. Brazil Lab will produce innovative knowledge and transformative knowledge. Hello, good evening. Welcome, one and all, to Forest and Collaborative Survival. This is the first session of the partnership between Brazil Lab and Flip. This edition has an original relationship between plants, artistic thought, and thinking about different ways of building a world. I am João Biehl. I am an anthropology professor at Princeton, and I am also the director of Brazil Labs on behalf of the university, of my colleagues. I would like to thank Flip's curators and the organizing committee for this partnership, and also to the program from the High Meadows Environmental Institute, which supports this event. We have with us today 2 intellectuals who creatively will travel between literature and critical literature, between journalism and movie making and cinematography. They are fully engaged with environmental issues, social injustice in our worlds that are adrift, with a special eye to the value that forests have, and also how their caretakers will work with the neo-strategist capitalism, the exclusion, the policy of exclusions, and our disconnected way of life, disconnected from the environment. João Moreira Salles, he's a cinematographer, documentarist. He's the founder of Biehl. He directed Notícias de uma Guerra Particular, Nelson Freire, Entre Atos, Santiago, and No Intenso Agora. He is the chairperson and co-founder of Serrapilheira, created to value scientific knowledge and to increase its visibility in the country. More recently, João published Arrabalde, an amazing series of articles about his immersion in the Amazon region. The book version will be published this year by Companhia das Letras. Rob Nixon is a full professor in Princeton. He is a natural from South Africa. He's wrote many books, among them Slow Violence and the Environmentalism.
Dreambirds, the natural history.
Dreambirds. I'm sorry, we lost the speaker for a couple of seconds. And he deals with the post-colonial era and the decolonization of nonfiction and contemporary literature. As a public intellectual, Rob has focused on environmental violence and the global South and the climate crisis. Rob is a contributor to the New Yorker, Slate, and London Review of Books, and New York Times and The Guardian. Thank you, Rob and João, for joining us and having accepted this invitation by Brazil Lab. It's such an honor to have you here to kick off this partnership with Flip. We will move forward by asking a couple of questions regarding, for our guests, and then after the answers, Rob and João will ask each other questions. For those who are at home, you can participate in this conversation through our YouTube channel. You can put in your questions, and the questions are open now. So thank you for joining us. Rob, let's start with you. In your fascinating essay, The Less Selfish Gene, the florestal altruism and the tree of life, you see the growing interest of science and literature in the processes of communication of plants. What are the main motivating factors of your public fascination that goes beyond the native population communities with the cooperative aspects of forest as a life system? What is historically and politically game here, at stake here?
Yeah, thank you so much, João Biehl and João Salles, and everybody who's organized this, and especially the interpreters, Anna and Chris. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. So in answer to your question, João, there's a TED Talk by Suzanne Simard, who's an ecologist from Canada, and it's called How Trees Talk to Each Other. And it has gone viral, several million hits, and it's been translated into 37 languages. And that's just one example of a whole eruption of public interest in books and documentaries and podcasts and TED Talks about the complex communication channels between trees and plants and fungal networks in the forest. And so you have books like How Forests Think, Can You Hear the Trees, The Hidden Networks of the Forest, book after book, dozens of these types of books. And so I mentioned Suzanne Simard at the beginning, and she's a very foundational thinker here. And she got involved with the forestry department in Canada, and they were wanting to maximize the profit from a tree called the Douglas fir, which is an enormous tree and has a very high market value. And the Douglas fir often coexist with birch trees, which the foresters see as junk trees, as worthless. They have no market value. So their thinking was, if we fell all the birch trees, we create more living room for the Douglas firs. They will grow bigger and better and faster, and we will make more money. To their surprise, the opposite happened, that many of the Douglas firs started to sicken and die. And in subsequent research, Simard and her team deduced that there are these fungal networks under the earth connecting these two species. So in a way, they were companion species. And so you had these arterial flows of water, nutrients, carbon, chemicals that would help protect the plants against pathogens. And so together, the two species were stronger than they were individually. And so one of the things that comes out of this is a line of questioning about the idea, a crude neo-Darwinian idea of the survival of the fittest, of the individual as the unit of survival, as opposed to a more collaborative outlook. So the question remains, why now? Why is there this huge eruption of public interest now? And Suzanne Simard's research started in the 1990s, so it's been around a long time. But my argument is basically that after several decades of neoliberalism, where we've seen in society after society, the gap widen between the super rich and the abandoned poor, and the hollowing out of the middle of society. This is particularly perhaps since the economic crash of 2008 around the world. There is a lot of yearning, a hunger among many people, readers, viewers. There's a hunger for exploring other social models that are less violent in their division between the winners and the losers. And so I think that there's a way in which this collaborative element in forest life has a kind of an allegorical appeal. This is the society of the forest. Is there anything we in human society can learn from that dynamic? And so this is not to romanticize or sentimentalize the forest. If any of you spend time in forests, you know there's a lot of ferocious competition in the forest. But flourishing depends on a duet between collaboration and competition. And I think a lot of people at this moment in history feel that that duet is out of key. This blend, these two voices of collaboration and competition are out of key. And so I think this is part of the allure of these forest dynamics.
Rob, breve
And Rob, maybe a follow-up question, in literature, what is this a forest change? What does it do to literature, this new way of thinking about the forest?
Well, one of the things it does is it expands the idea of community. And so it looks at community. If we think of a book like The Overstory by the American writer Richard Powers that won a lot of prizes, he takes Suzanne Simard as a character. He makes a version of her as a character and looks at her research as a way of thinking forward to alternative ways of coexistence within human society and within more than human society. And I think so one of the things it does is it pushes back against an instrumental economics that is founded in kind of Enlightenment ideas of dominion over nature, sees humanity as part of nature, and looks at what we may learn from other social models where humans are not at the center. And clearly this connects up in many ways to many avenues of indigenous thought that approach, that refuse that binary between the human and the commodity in waiting, which is the perception of the forest as just a set of commodities in waiting. And so we see that play out in the literature. Yeah.
Well, fantastic, Rob.
Fantastic, Rob. Thank you so much for this initial presentation. So, João, in Arrabalde, you structure your narrative around two recurring topics: the misunderstanding of the colonizer when facing the Amazon forest, and the absence of the forest in the collective imagination of Brazilians in Brazil. Can you explain how the system was crystallized during your travels through the Amazon region? Sorry, I was on mute. Yes. First of all, I would like to thank everyone here, Rob and also João, for having invited me a crease and all those, and also, of course, a flip, a rectangle flip. So, João, when I got to Belém in August 2019, I got there really early. It was in the wee hours. It was a city that I had been maybe for 1 or 2 days. I didn't have actually a life inside the bioma. So I was going to stay there for 4 or 5 months, and I got there in the wee hours, and I had a very early meeting the next day. So I opened the window, and what I saw, and if you could put the video maybe, because what I saw, the first thing was my first impression of was given to me by this scene, which is the sunrise at 6 a.m. over the city of Belém in the Amazon. So I wrote this in the beginning of my series, and now I will just read an excerpt here. So it's one latitude that will separate Belém from the equator. And during the day, the sun will bash our heads, our shoulders, buildings, the sidewalks, the buses. It will bash everything. So the scene is monochromatic. And in it, tropics have been fully eliminated. And the city was there, but it could be anywhere. The impression is that Belém doesn't know where it is anymore. And this is Belém, the city of Belém, not as an exception, but actually Belém is a shortcut that helped me at least to understand how we occupy that bioma. Maybe in one sentence, we never wanted to get to know the forest. The idea was always to replace. We wanted to replace things, one thing for another. What was strange into something familiar, one flora with the next, one fauna with the next, the disorder of the forest, of the jungle, and bring it order through a plantation, through crops, and maybe a continuous organized landscape of crops, and the abundance of species, and no species dominates, they're always in balance. And just with a with just a handful of plants and a couple of human domesticated animals, especially cattle, which today occupies most of the devastated lands in the Amazon region. So this occupation of the bioma can be understood like a reduction from the much for the very few, for the little. It's to change what was in abundance and replaced by something that is scarce, with a full lack of a variety. And when I say we, when I'm talking about we, I'm talking about us, Brazilians, those that are not part of that biome and that occupy that biome. First Europeans, and then mostly Brazilians migrated from the south of the country, occupying the north of the country. So all these people had never seen a forest. They don't see the forest still. And since the very beginning, one of the things I did was to go back in time and try to see the first reports, the first witnesses of those who came to the forest for the first time, and that would write something about it, write what they were saying. And the first sentence of this mismatch was written by a Dominican, Frei Gaspar de Carvajal. He was history recognized him as the first crossing of the Amazon River from one side to the other, done by Europeans in 1541. And the last leg, sort of lap of the trip, he was already getting closer to Marajó Island. He looks at the margins of the Amazon River and he writes this. He says, it is a temperate land where we will have wheat and we will have all fruitful trees. And it also ready to raise cattle, because there are herbs like in our native Spain, such as oreganos, and different areas. We have different very good herbs. And we see the different lands, highs and lows, and then we see different oak trees and different trees. So oregano is a Mediterranean plant. It does not exist natively in the Amazon, and we don't have other species of plants, and we don't have azinhais. So he saw what he wanted to see. More precisely, he saw what he knew. He saw what he brought in his eyes from Europe. He brought his world and projected it to the Amazon region. And he is responsible also for baptizing. He called Amazon, Amazon. And also, in the end of this trip, the Spaniards who were with him were attacked. And the report is a report of a number of attacks, actually. There was an enormous population in the Amazon, and that starts to disappear at that moment because of the diseases and everything that brought by Europeans. But he's attacked, his group is attacked, and then he thinks that he's attacked by warriors, by very tall women who were very courageous, and he called her Amazons. He thought that he was being attacked by the mythological, also again by the cognitive understanding of European. And so these warriors, these women warriors never existed. They are myths, mythological, that he brought from Europe. So the name Amazon is a misinterpretation, a misunderstanding. And so I guess misunderstanding is there since the very beginning. The way he saw things, he sees the fauna and the flora, and how he sees humans with which he interacts. And none of them were seen. They were all transformed in something else in his eyes, and something that he already brought in his own mind. And so this erasing of that region, which is what really caught my attention when I was traveling through the Amazon, is curious because it is expressed in a very simple way. In Belém, you can catch a cab, for instance, and the cabs to protect themselves from the sun in a city that has cut down all its trees, its green coverage. They have to protect themselves from the sun. They do that by putting the those shades, with a tinted glass in their cars to protect them from the heat, so that the temperature inside the car is unbearable. But these tinted glasses are very the densest. They are so dark. They have to be, because you're just 1 degree latitude from the equator. So what happens is this: the city disappears. You can't see it. When you're inside a cab in the city of Belém, you don't see the city, especially when you have the afternoon when the sun is going down, and they're so dark, so tinted, these glasses, that they have to protect themselves from the sun. And the natural coverages would be the forest, the trees, and everything was eliminated. You also eliminated the city itself, and the only thing you see is an artificial environment from inside a car. Again, people naturalize this elimination of their environment. So at the end of my trip in December, after having visited almost a good part of the state of Pará, and to see the forest being converted in other things, not a forest anymore, I saw again a scene in Belém, and this is something that was amazing. And I wrote about it in the last part of Arrabalde, and I guess it's let me read it to you, and then I will close my first answer. In a morning of December 2019, in the Castanheira neighborhood, this is a neighborhood in the city of Belém, there was a security guard of the Universal Church of Reino de Deus was watching the cars go by. The top of the stairs, among the ugliness, there was the man, not even one shadow to protect him. It was 8 a.m., 36 degrees Celsius, and he was wearing a suit, a tie, all black. He was closed. His jacket was closed. It was unbearable. The security guard in black under the sun is not feasible. It's not viable. If he stays there throughout the morning, he will faint. If he isn't supported, he will die. And this means two things. First, the natural landscape that was eliminated year after year is no longer able to protect him. And that the landscape that replaces it, built with lots of work, is not alienated from life. So I guess this is something that can be said about the Amazon in general. I guess the man in a black suit under the sun of the equator is that figure. He is the cattle, he is the soy, he is the gold diggers, he is the wood. He's the way that one landscape was replaced by another without ever questioning the feasibility of that exchange. And we are paying the price now for that.
That's so strong, this extinction of the humans in this tragic transformation of the world. The little bit that's left that echoes with Rob's introductory remarks, this neoliberalism that's so exclusionary and so unfair and so full of inequalities and without possibilities. And continuing a little bit along this thread of thinking the frontier and what the frontier does with the social and the human, and basically with the forest, reducing it to a commodity. You talked about from the much to the little. Considering, João, the experiences of other countries in the Americas, which also invented and conquered their frontiers with a lot of complex processes of displacing populations, genocide, and how do you conceive the relationship between Brazil and the Amazon forest, and what possibilities exist for placing horizontally the Adriana Petrini horizoning work with this nature, which is out of control, runaway nature. We're losing our capacity for horizoning, for prospecting the horizons. How do you view, in the context of the Americas, how this Brazil's frontier mindset with regard to the Amazon, how does it cross or compare to other experiments in the experiences in the Americans, what's happening with the possibility of horizoning, given the course of things in the Amazon? Okay, this question of a new relationship to the forest is one of the questions that we should ask Rob. I'm going to ask for Rob to answer this later because I think his answer will be much better than mine. But what I can say with regard to the issue of our relationship to how other peoples have occupied the forest. I'm not a historian, so what I know about this is very little, but I'm going to talk about one experience that called my attention that has to do with Princeton, actually has to do with you, because in 2019, Brazil Lab organized an event on the Amazon that I participated in, and one of the presentations was by Robert Sokolov, who's going to appear here as well in a conversation, I believe, with Beto Verissimo. Sokolov is a professor emeritus of the study on environmental studies at the University of Princeton University, and Sokolov showed an image, American Progress. If you could show this picture, it's the second picture here, the second image, which is by John Gast's, one of his paintings. It's an allegory, well-known allegory of the doctrine, Manifest Destiny doctrine and the expansion, westward expansion of the United States. So if you have this female figure, which represents progress, and she moves from the east, the luminous, to the east, to the shadowy west, taking the white settlers with her, who will take civilization, and the native peoples are fleeing, and the fauna, all the animals are fleeing, and behind her comes electricity, trains, and electrification. She has an electrical wire, and she weaves, which is a telegraph wire, the path of the white settlers. Fine. Sokolov, after having shown the presentations to the Brazilians and having heard the Brazilians and perceived from the Brazilians that the Amazon is basically real estate speculation. That's the main, it's land grabbing in the Amazon that's the land grabbing public lands. Well understood. Sokolov, looking at the painting, said the following phrase: the American West is the Brazilian North. And this stuck with me in my head. And I included that yes and no, because in other words, yes, because as I wrote in my first article, despite the huge differences, historical differences between the occupation of the Amazon by Brazilians and occupation of the American West by the Americans, in both cases, we're talking about human contingents who left behind the little that they had, and encouraged by governments, that's important, they launched into life in another place. But It's also no, and I believe that the no perhaps be the more important than the yes, because there's not a Brazilian correlate of American progress. And with this, I mean to say the following, that our symbolic production on the forest is poor, scanty. The landscape of the American West became part of the common heritage of the United States. It's a geography which provides belonging, and this belonging was provided by cinema, music, literature. The landscape kind of traverses Americans' bodies, saying that I'm American and I'm unlike Brazil. The contrast is huge because the forest does not occupy a major part of our mental economy. I would say that it's a very small role. The space that it occupies is virtually nil. Obviously, it was not because of lack of material. We could have used the indigenous cosmogonies and cosmovisions, the naturalists, the travelers, in a word, events, historical events, like the War of the Cabanas, the rubber cycle, Fordlandia, the Madeira Mamoré Railway. There's an epic trail in the Amazon, which was not transformed into symbolic matter or material, and hasn't colonized Brazilians' imagination. So I received from a friend of mine recently, very recently, a friend who read Arrabalde about my training, by my formative years by Joaquim Nabuco. And Joaquim Nabuco, the Brazilian parliamentarian in the 19th century, the feeling in us is Brazilian. The imagination is European. All the landscapes, the Amazon forest, the pampas in Argentina are not one part of Via Appia, one visit to one part of the Seine Wharf, or the Louvre in the middle of the theaters and politics. There are always squatters, as if we were still knocking down the native forest. And this is a feeling that we find as well again and again in most of the classical reports on the Amazon. Just to give an example, which is Euclides da Cunha of the Backlands. He was the one that traveled the posthumous book by his, in the first 3 pages, by Euclides da Cunha, the author of the Backlands, his experience in the Amazon. He writes that the Amazon River is a disappointment, the landscape is monotonous, the horizons are empty, nature is disorder, the flora is imperfect, the fauna is monstrous, the amphibians are Paleozoic, the bird that you saw is despicable, and nature is incomplete. And the title of the book that he used, he dies before the book was published, but he had already had the proofs. The title is In the Margin of History. In other words, there's a story or a history, but the forest is outside of history. Nothing happened there in the Amazon forest yet. It's virgin land waiting for a beginning. And the beginning is obviously going to be given by Europeans. The first chapter of the book is called In the Amazon, a Land Without History. And it's an extraordinary book, highly sensitive, because it talks about the rubber groves and how the workers are enslaved in the rubber groves, but no sensitivity whatsoever or sensibility for the forest or for the biome. So to conclude, João, my hypothesis in Arrabalde is that this indifference is functional. It serves a purpose and a use, and its use is that it facilitates the work of destruction of the forest, because you destroy much easier what is not has no affection or interest or curiosity from the people or love from the people. And this is something which I saw not only the reports of Carvajal and Euclides da Cunha, but in the discourse of the settlers that came to the Amazon in the 1960s, 1970s, who prospered in the Amazon, who made their America in the Amazon, and who invite you to their homes. They have beautiful homes, and people who prospered, made their fortunes in the Amazon, and their cattle raisers and so forth. And how did you come to the Amazon? Tell me your story. And all of them say the same thing. When I got here, I had nothing. this I had nothing is simply the biological system, the most complex. There was nothing here when I got here. It was one of the most complex biomes. It was when I came home, there was nothing here when I got here, they say. So what you can see in the porches and the verandas is you can have coffee. It's very educational. For you see from the verandas is a landscape that to hills and crops, pastures from the top of the hills. You can see just a few sketty on the flatlands. You can see their crops on the hillsides. You have the white cattle, and these verandas, therefore, are the achievement and fulfillment of a successful project of metamorphosis after a life of work. What the settlers find to have in front of their eyes is the world that they saw when they were young. In other words, you go back to Carvajal, looking at Spain, and from Spain, the banks of the Amazon, but the means to transform. Brazilians had these means to transform the Amazon, and helped by the government, they exchanged the landscape for and producing the environmental catastrophe that we're all familiar with. Okay, Rob, making a connection with you and your work. You also, your work is concerned with the lethality and the effacements and erasures of the frontier projects based on the mortality, based on what you told us about your current forest turnaround, and thinking with João that he just talked about the Amazon frontier. I would like to hear from you and hear you talk a little bit more about the differences between the forest and plantations, and also it can be a central piece to understand our societies and ways of life that are behind these effacements and these absences that João also is mentioning, this incapacity to consider otherness and their diversity. What implications do you see, Rob, epistemic and ethical and political implications that the plantation brings to our discussion concerning living life in the forest?
Yeah, this is a good connection with what João was talking about with misperception. The plantation is an anti-forest. And what we've seen around the world is the mushrooming of plantations, particularly eucalyptus and conifers, and on all the continents. And so there would be situations where I would arrive and look at the loss of the forest, and there's now a plantation there, and somebody said, "Oh, this is the new forest." And so it's important to distinguish a forest from a plantation for a variety of reasons. For the plantation is a monoculture. It's the industrialization of trees rather than the replacement of one old growth forest with a new type of forest. And it's a simplification of the life system. So they typically are very barren biomes, ecologically barren. There are also, particularly with the acceleration of climate change impacts, they are more susceptible to disease in the ways that I described earlier. You don't have these complex systems that have checks and balances on the survival of the ecosystem. And so it's obviously we need plantations, but it's for wood industry and so forth, and for lumber. But it's important not to make a category mistake that a plantation is a type of forest. A plantation is just an army of trees that simply exist entirely within the mindset of the commodity. Could I have the first image? Oh, yeah. So this is a beautiful image by Katie Holton, who's an Irish artist. And what I love about this is her sense of the deep complexity of below, the life below, the invisible. And we're realizing how little we understand of that complexity. But this is a forest with different tree species, different sizes of trees, and this very dynamic world beneath. And I think that's the difference between the biological complexity of the old forest and the simulacrum of a forest, of the plantation, which exists entirely for speed. You have fast-growing plants like trees like eucalyptus and conifers. So it's about speed and converting life into money at a high rate in very much the terms of the neoliberal temporal framework, that time is money, and therefore quick-growing trees constitute better value for money, and they can also be a front for an idea of a forest that really isn't a forest. So I wanted to come back to João, your work, and to think of this wonderful piece, the section of the book that you wrote called The Difficult Forest. And I wondered if you could tease out for us a few of the layers of difficulty in your title and in the essay, maybe both historically and in the contemporary moment. And then sort of on a slightly different note, you know, I work in language. You are both a writer and a documentary filmmaker. And so I thought it might be valuable for us to have you reflect on, or invite you to reflect on, some of the rewards and the challenges of working in those two different mediums as you approach the forest.
Eu estava congelado. Eu acho que a dificuldade, Rob,
I guess the difficulty, Rob, it's not one single difficulty. These are many difficulties. There are different incarnations, so to speak. I guess the first difficulty has to do with the living experience of the body. The forest isn't welcoming. It bites, it hurts, it stings, it poisons, it harms, it infects. And this is the forest we see in the reports of most writers. It's a place of loneliness, of fear. Carvajal is a place of hunger. They have to walk on all fours because they are unable to stand, because they're hungry, they don't have how to eat. And they're simply, again, in the richest biome and the greatest abundance of life. And but they're unable to see the forest, so they don't know what you can or cannot eat. So this Herzog forest from Herzog's films is a hostile forest. Euclides da Cunha, again, the writer of Backlands, I guess he was a person who better expressed this feeling. He said, the dominant impression I have is this: the man there is still an impertinent intruder. Impertinent and undesired, because he says that sovereign and brutal nature and expanding its energies is an adversary, an opponent of man. Humboldt, who was probably the greatest naturalist who ever traveled through the Amazon forest, wrote something similar to this, but in a more positive stance. He said that man didn't fit in the forest, and maybe he was right. You have to leave the forest to the forest. But it's very rare to see any writer who are able to describe the forest, and also the cinematographers who are able to film the forest, because it wins over even the best cinematographers. The forest will always escape. It's like a child, you know, the child trying to hold a basketball, and that's it. The forest will always escape. You can't hold it. And also there's a challenge, intellectual challenge. And here I will use something that Carlos Fausto has said, and they're very good to use here. The Amazon has different forms of life, but the intervals of this life is too small. There's just too much life together. And for the Western mindset, this mesh of biology is a disorder, it's chaos, it's monstrosity. And this is why the forest is hostile, and it's hostile towards the body, but it's hostile towards the spirit. It confronts the Western thinking untrained thinking. And Fausto talks about untrained, about the aesthetics of the small intervals. So this abundance with great difficulty of understanding. In the Princeton meeting, one of those, there was a Simon Levy, who is a director from the Biocomplexity Center at the Environmental Institute at Princeton. And he said this about, from the understanding standpoint, tropical ecosystems are comparable to the understanding of the universe. The complexity of a forest is infinite, and this is Levy saying. And then he smiled and concluded it's easy to put the man on the moon to understanding a forest. It will always escape, and it's fleeting. It's almost an aggression against our cognitive understanding. It's once you exemplify it, you domesticated it. So the reduction of a forest into a plantation is a way of trying to escape from not understanding, from what can't be understood, and also transforming this into something that is simpler, less complex, easier to understand, and that we can become the owners. It can become proprietary to us. We are in the dominating stance where we are able to dominate all that land and all the logic and all the understanding of that space and that landscape. So the logic of a forest is unheard. And Simon is one of those who actually makes this very clear. The proliferation of connections, this dialogue, this conversation that happens underground is absolutely incomprehensible. And this is an offense to this domination spirit, to the Western domination spirit. So many are the difficulties. And with regards to writing or filming, I went to the Amazon as a reporter, as a journalist, and not as a documentarist, a documentarian, I'm sorry. And I brought a cell phone, and I wanted to every day just film 5 minutes, not 6, 5. So I had to choose very carefully those 5 minutes that seemed to be the best one for those days. And of course, you don't know what's going to come after. So if you film something at 10 a.m. and then you have something amazing happening at 3 p.m., you can't record that. So this would demand a certain discipline of attention. And this made my job actually easier as a journalist, as a reporter, because I had to see things all the time very carefully. So I guess since attention is one of the modalities of affection, so to speak, of respect, I would put myself in a situation of trying to understand that place I was in and to respect it and to see everything and not believe that one thing was necessarily more interesting than the next. So what I'm going to do with these images, I have no idea. Maybe a visual essay, I'm not sure. But these are two different things. So the articles, the series are a type of interpretation, intellectual interpretation, that is, it sounds a bit pretentious, I'm sorry, but an interpretation of a thought, of the thinking of what I witnessed in the Amazon. And I guess the film would be an expression of an experience, what it is to be there in the forest. And that's a different thing. One thing would be a way of being in a place, and the other will be, at least the writing, the journalistic approach will describe something that I perceived and trying to distill everything that I've heard and seen. I guess this is it. Now I have the right to ask you a question, right, Rob? Yes, to continue this exchange, because it has to do with this whole idea of the experience of being somehow different and being in another way. And in the essay, the very moving essay you wrote, and also sad, about the martyrs of the forest, and you borrow a word from Arundhati, the Indian writer, and this expression, she talks about having a different imagination. And you say that she, the writer, she said this other way of being in the world is a necessary condition for the forest not to disappear, two champions of the forest who were killed in 2011, Maria and Zé Cláudio Santos, of which over which you talk about, the extractivist couple in Pará who were killed in Pará and Altamira. According to you, they both had this distinguished imagination, different imagination, and this is why they lived. And here I'm using what you wrote. They would live peacefully with the non-human communities of the forest. So I would like to ask you is if you could describe the qualities of this different imagination, this distinctive imagination, especially when they relate to the short time period and the long time period. And I find this fascinating.
Thank you, João. Could I have the second image? Right, so this is an image, it's a painting called Deep Rooted by a Spanish artist called Sam 3, street artist. And one of the things I find powerful about it too, and speaks to the question you raised, João, about how can we interpret time differently? How can we shift the imaginative perspective on both the forest and the long forest in time? And so I think this is a very powerful image, because you have the surface act, both on the surface of the land and the surface of time. You have the felling of the tree, and then you have the ripple effects, the arterial flow of implications in deep time. And that deep time is both biological, and it's geological, and it's hidden, and it's consequential. And so you're dealing with the body of the land, and you're dealing with the body of time. And also we have clearly the one body is both a tree and the human torso. And the act of felling the tree becomes an act of self-decapitation. And so it's an image that I think is grappling with how do we break free from the idea that we can attack the forest in instant after instant after instant without cumulative effects. That flowing invisibly in a form of kind of slow violence across time, and so I find this is it's a perspective that speaks to me of a different relationship, both to the forest that is not purely instrumental, and also an attitude towards time that is it's on speaking terms with many indigenous views of time as intergenerational and indeed intermillennial, you might say, the longue durée of flourishing that requires an acknowledgement that we are part of nature and nature is part of us. Thank you. You can shut the image.
So, Rob, continuando nessa linha.
So continuing in this line of thought, and how you work with here at Princeton with scientists, also with the scientists of the Environmental Institute of the Princeton Environmental Institute. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how scientists are also part of this different imagination. What are scientists doing to have a differentiated imagination, different from the processes, the environmental processes, biological processes, and how can this also impact our ability of thinking about different interventions in the sense of collective actions?
It's been fascinating working in an environment where the majority of people are scientists. because what I have found is the scientists are very receptive to the need for interpretive bridges to general publics, and that requires these images, these forms of reinterpretation that João was talking about, and also requires storytelling that can complement the data. That I think a lot of scientists, particularly people who committed to work on climate breakdown and biodiversity loss, water insecurity, food insecurity, these issues, they will produce the data, and then they don't see corresponding effects in the policy world. And so they're both committed to the science and also frustrated by the lack of an impact. And I think the scientists that I've spoken to, that I work with, are very receptive to the value of the arts, the humanities, the different media platforms that we have as a necessary supplement or a necessary partner, if you like, in trying to both convey the data, but also convey what the data cannot convey, which is some of the issues that João has touched on so eloquently in his writing and today, which is the instability of perception and the need to constantly challenge a simplified hegemonic perspective, whether it's of a plantation or of the forest as inherently inhospitable or as chaotic or so forth. So how do we ring the changes on those perspectives in ways that keeps different systems of valuation alive in the forest? And I think it's no coincidence. It's not coincidental that there's also been a very strong turn in the public sphere towards indigenous imaginations and looking for places of connection, possible connection to lines of thought, perceptual fields that are not subsumed under a kind of neoliberal instrumentalist commodity-only view of the natural world that incorporates us into the natural and acknowledges that we are part of the biome, you know, whether it's the biome in the gut or our relationship to COVID. There's no barrier, there's no clear-cut divide between the human and the non-human or the more than human.
Well, no.
João, posso...
Claro.
Would you allow me, João, please? May I just make a brief comment? What Rob was saying reminds me, you know, of the third image I brought. If you could please show the image I brought, I guess it really adds to what Rob just said. The third image here is it is the cover of a Sudan. Sudan is the superintendency of the development of the Amazon. This is a governmental entity or organization which finance the occupation of that biome. This magazine is from 1971, and this was, you know, at the height of the military program of the occupation of the Amazon. And because it was a land without, well, the whole motto was the Amazon was a land without people, so you will bring people who have no land because the native population doesn't count and that land is empty. So, and here you have the same image repeated twice, in which you see, Rob, on the top part, you see Amazon yesterday. In the center, it's Amazon today, and the lower image is the utopia where you want to be, the Amazon of tomorrow, where you don't have one single tree. The only thing you have is smoke, is a factory and a plant. I'm not sure if that's a building or a tractor. I'm not sure. To the right there, and this is how you understand this sentence, the statement I heard over and over again of those who went to the Amazon at the time, and they say, when I got here, there was nothing. And then you understand why there was nothing, because nothing was still a commodity. Nothing was priced. So this conversion of what is priceless into something that is just a commodity, just a price. And so you eliminate the forest, you just deforestate the world, the natural landscape, and you transform it into an environment in which everything you do is the production of merchandise, of commodities. Everything you do has a price to it, not a value, a price. It's possible very clearly to say how much this costs, but not how much it's worth, because the forest has disappeared. And this is a bit the movement that Brazil has been doing in a very expedited manner from 70 years on until now. There was a moment of during the government of President Lula, former President Lula, especially when we had Marina in the ministry, and the forest was being valued as a forest. And now we're back to the square zero, to the previous regime, to this kind of cover of Sudene, because Bolsonaro is a result of the military regime, the worst part of the military regime. And this is what he represents. So those who are watching us, João and Rob have been sending comments and questions and very instigating questions. And so I'm going to try to summarize a couple of questions in one. And I'm going to put it, let's say, in a bundle. And so you can freely associate and answer as you wish, and you might make any comments. So many questions, João, have to do with this blindness, the Amazon blindness of the colonizer that you illustrated so precisely. And Beto Verissimo, I guess your friend, he was your companion, your great friend and environmentalist, he asks, but who tried to understand the forest? Was there anyone who tried to understand the forest? And maybe a naturalist, Bates, Wallace, Humboldt, you've mentioned. So the question is, are there other narratives that might help us, some historical narrative of trying to maybe recover a possible understanding of the forest? And Professor Esther Berger from USP says, what other initiatives throughout the years happened in Brazil of trying to include the Amazon into the Brazilian imaginary in maybe education, child education, school education. And this bundle of questions will end with Sylvia's question. What are the actions that could be considered so that the Amazon is finally included in the Brazilian imagination? So there's this arc of narratives, counter narratives, what initiatives happened in past decades and other periods, but also in a more visionary and horizontal approach in terms of how the Amazon can be included in the Brazilian imagination. So this is the first bundle of questions.
A second bundle of questions more directly connected to the discourse and the work and the contributions that Rob has made. And from Princeton, they're asking Rob, Lucas Prates, how does contemporary literature has given you dealt with the violence of plantation? They're talking about communication by plants and communication by plants, but the violence inherent to the plantation, and this also present side by side with the forest. How is this violence dealt with by contemporary literature? How to confront this violence, meanwhile that we imagine, even while imagine new worlds. And our Michelis Moody also asks Rob Nixon, given these differences between the plantation and the forest and the need to rethink the forest, whether as inspiration or as a model, to what archives, as a good historian, he should say that which archives and files can we look to as humanists. The forest turnaround opens what kind of space to and room for archives for the production of knowledge. And last question from Maria Luisa Lucas, also in this context of the discussion on the plantation in the forest, how can we transform interest by the general public in the forest in actual struggles of support for the indigenous struggles who occupy these spaces, the indigenous peoples who suffer from the encroachment of the plantations. So there's a bundle of comments and questions, instigating comments and questions, which the people from the audience are sending in the chat box. So we have a few minutes left. João and Rob, perhaps João, you can begin, and then Rob can take over in the comments, in his comments. Okay, there are many reports of people being bedazzled by the forest. The naturalists have this virtue. They enter to know, to see, to look. They don't bring a ready-made forest. They want to see the tropical world. Humboldt, for example, who I believe was the most extraordinary traveler in the Amazon region, this vein of the naturalist, says that as soon as he reached Venezuela, he came with a French friend, a biologist of his, friend of his. We raced from one side like fools. There was so much life. His friend said that it was rather an introvert. He said he would go crazy if these wonders did not end along this kind of feeling you find in Bates, you find in Wallace as well. You find this kind of enchantment in people like Wilson, who wrote on the forest in the time of rainfall. His report is extraordinary. You have photographers like Luis Draga, who does moving records of Marajó Island. So these reports exist, but they are reports, so to speak. It's the B side, the front side of the record that everybody reads and listens to. That side of the record is the report by of fear, hunger in the forest as hostile forest. And Humboldt, and that's why he's extraordinary, he wonders in the fact that the forest wants to expel him, throw him out. He understands that that is a biome in balance and equilibrium. He is the monster there. Humboldt realizes, and he respects that. He thinks that it's precisely that's how it should be. The indigenous peoples have almost always lived in the headwaters of the rivers, and they enter into the forest to hunt and come back. The forest, the dense forest, they ended up going because they were thrown off the headwaters, the rivers, but they opened up these clearings and they built their villages on the clearings, and that's the forest. It's a way that it protects itself, and it avoids occupation that way, this dense forest. So these reports exist, and travel diaries, they're not, unfortunately, they're not hegemonic. The hegemonic report is one of fear and terror, and how to do this. It's a question about how to do this and have it incorporated into Brazilians' national imagination. Listen to the indigenous peoples, read Ailton Krenak and the other indigenous thinkers. We have an inflection, a turning point now. It's fascinating, where the true protagonists in the defense of the forest are the indigenous leaders, and they are becoming visible and vocal with regard to that. In other words, the only thing that we Brazilians can be proud of from the point of view of defense of the forest and the active defense of the forest in the last 3-4 years was the example given by the indigenous peoples occupying Brazil, going to public and striking out in the defense of the forest. So that's why I think that we need to become permeable and porous to their discourse. I don't know if this, João, means horizoning, but certainly that's what needs to happen. We talk too much. It's time for us to be silent and listen. And we have to listen, because these reports by Humboldt, Bates, and Wallace and enchantment have been there since the beginning. The original peoples are defenders of the forest because they are enchanted by the forest. They understand that that is this vital sap without which there's no life, in a very deep and profound way. In a very profound way, life, not only their life, it's the life of all creatures and non-human creatures, to use the term, the non-human community, it's a kind of a polis of what is living. And this, the original peoples understood, and that's what we need to incorporate. There was never an effort by the Brazilian state to do this. Never, never. There are people, notable people like Rondon, but it's an exception. I was talking with Ricardo Enriquez, who's a person who went to he was in the Ministry of Education. Ricardo Enriquez, at the time he was there, they realized that in the school books distributed to all schools, they didn't talk about one single species from the Amazon. They talked about eucalyptus, they talked about in the biology classes, but they didn't talk of one single species from the Amazon. That's why I talk about it in Ahabaldi, the backlands, in my book. The title of the book, The Backlands, because the outskirts, it was always been the outskirts, the forgotten part, the distant part of Brazil, the part like the outskirts that you never visit. And it's always been like in the Brazilian imagination, except for the first peoples. It's the only thing that is relevant for Brazil. There's nothing more relevant. We've become a very irrelevant country geopolitically in the world, except for the outskirts, the backlands. We should realize that we will become the outskirts, and this center is the Amazon. It's the first peoples, they understood that it's the center of the earth. That's why we have to listen to them and hear them. This is essential, I believe. That's fantastic. João, Rob, your turn.
There's a lot to address here. Maybe I'll start with Maria Luisa's question about the indigenous. And, over and over again, indigenous people would say, we don't own the land owns us. And you hear this chorus across many, many communities. And so I think one of the practical things that is being done in some places is helping those indigenous who wanted to achieve title deed to the land so that the land is formalized. And this comes back to what João was talking about earlier around emptiness, the land without a people and the people without a land. To formally and legally push back against that idea of emptiness. It could be terra nullius in Australia. There's always a construction of this myth of emptiness. We see it with Palestine and Golden Meir saying the same thing there. So it's a recurrent settler colonial motif. And so what we are seeing in many parts of the world is a situation where the indigenous are sort of amphibious between two legal systems or two systems of relation to the land. A belief system, an older belief system, whereby the land owns them, and then the contemporary system in which they're trying to have one foot in order to have the paperwork to show that it's not empty. And just let me give a specific example from the tropics in Liberia, in West Africa, where there was a community of indigenous people who were dependent on the forest. And one day they saw people they had never seen before appear and start fencing off the forest and cutting it down. And they turned it into a palm oil plantation. And it turned out these people were from a Malaysian corporation, and they had been sold this forest because in the official maps in the capital, it said empty land. And these people had been living for generations off the forest, and they didn't know that they didn't own it, in a sense. But what was very interesting was that there had been some British researchers who had gone out and studied this village adjoining the forest a few years earlier. And they had found that it was a poor community in the sense that 1/3 of the people didn't have jobs. But what they found was zero childhood malnutrition because of the variety of fruits and bushmeat and so forth. They had a very varied and balanced diet off this forest, which they didn't know they needed to own. So it was a case of how do we even perceive poverty and ownership in relation to these ecosystem peoples who have a dynamic, a long-standing dynamic relationship with this land that wasn't recognized in the paperwork. And so, you know, different communities are choosing differently, but, you know, in many places, they're deciding to create a hybrid relationship, one that's ancestral and one that is bureaucratic in a sense. So I don't know if there's any more time. I just wanted to pick up this question about the archives. I'm not a historian, so I can't really answer that question with any subtlety. But I will say that I think there is this key dimension to perceiving or reimagining the forest, is not seeing the forest as just trees plus. In many forests, the trees don't even constitute the majority of the biomass. It's just this incredible profundity of life. And so that, you know, loops back to this question that I raised earlier, or that you asked me about the plantation, is that is just about trees. The forest is about so much more than trees. And that is where I do find this fascination, scientific and public fascination with the what's called the Wood Wide Web, this fungal network. It's not just about the canopy, it's what we can't see that is so rich and diverse and absolutely essential to biological flourishing, including that of Homo sapiens.
Okay, so unfortunately, desculpe o inglês.
Sorry.
Infelizmente,
Unfortunately,
a gente está chegando ao
we are reaching the end of our event.
que evento forte,
What a strong, powerful, striking,
de abrir os olhos ainda mais.
awesome event to open up our eyes even more, but full of
De muita tensão, de
a lot of tension and a lot of
muita vontade de que as coisas
effect
sejam
in the
diferentes.
desire for things to be different.
Vamos ter que encerrar a
And
conversa aqui,
we're
mas
going
as
to
questões
have to
levantadas
end the conversation here, but the issues that have been raised here will be with us. We are all hugely grateful to Rob, Nixon, and João Salles for their generous contribution by their work, vital work, and visionary work. And we also want to thank the fantastic translation team, Chris and Anna, and the technical team, Antonio Camila. Thank you very much indeed for your support. And people at home in the audience, thank you for participating in this session. And to the forest and the collaborative survival. Unfortunately, we didn't have time for all the questions and commentary, but we hope that you will continue to participate in the activities in Brazil Lab. Don't forget that on Tuesday, the 30th at 4 p.m. Brazil time, we're going to continue our partnership with Flip, the incredible translators, and our dear friend from the Brazil Lab, Flora Thompson. Katrina Dodson will be with us with our colleague, Pedro Monteiro, the co-curator of Flip on translating the forest. The broadcast will occur here in the Flip channel. And on Wednesday, on December 1st at 6:30 p.m. Brazil time, we're going to continue the conversation on the YouTube channel in Brazil Lab. This time we'll be discussing the role of public policies in preservation of the Amazon. This partnership with the initiative Amazon 2030, Beto Verissimo, the environmentalist who traveled, and Kinemas Thaisa will be talking with the Robert Sokolov, the researcher from Princeton, that João cited. And one last question that I almost asked myself, but the technical people said that we had to. João Moreira is a colleague and friend from the Amazon. He asked this question. It's a striking question. It's for all of us. How can we do Amazoning? How can we Amazon the planet? So let's continue this conversation on Wednesday as well for Amazoning on the YouTube channel of Brazil Lab. Sign up in the YouTube channels, both the Flip and Brazil Lab YouTube channels, and activate the notifications. So again, thank you, João. Thank you, Rob. And good evening, everyone. And stay well and healthy, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.